We got to do a Machen horn since this is Machen content. All right, there we go. Welcome to a special Saturday night short notice Presbycast live show, and I'll explain why I'm doing this. It's because my wife's plane is late. I've got to pick her up at the airport, and I'm just trying to stay awake. I wrote a Substack article today, which I enjoyed writing, and it was, I think it's got an interesting angle. So we'll just go through that very quickly. And there's a visual element to all this, so maybe I'll put this out as an audio podcast next week, but for now, you got what you got. And we have a new version of one of our favorite songs for intro music, When the Saints Go Marching In. This one by a lovely woman named Donna. If you're watching on YouTube, you see Donna now, and boy, isn't she something? And that was sort of a Benny Hinn, When the Saints Go Marching In, with a little Dixieland. So it's hard to beat that. I think that's all we can say about that. It's hard to beat. But let's get over to the graphic that we need to talk about this Substack article, which I wrote today, and based on some research I did on newspapers.com, trying to track down a Machen letter to FDR, the president, and there's a letter that purports to be by him to FDR, but it's a misattribution on a couple of websites. But the real letter to FDR is only quoted in a book, and I'm trying to run that down. And that's going to be interesting as well. But in the meantime, I found this when doing a keyword search on newspapers.com. So the title of the piece is A Presbyterian Historical Snippet from 1926. Now, 1926 was sort of a weird in-between time for Machen. It was before the founding of Westminster Seminary in 29. It was kind of in the middle of the controversy, his struggle with J. Ross Stevenson and Erdman, and I'm not sure if the investigation was going on yet, so maybe Speer wasn't so much involved. But it was he was in between. He was in limbo, as he was really from the moment he entered the lists of ecclesial combat in the early 20s, and especially since he wrote Christianity and Liberalism. There'll be some ties to that book and probably some of its targets tonight. So again, a Presbyterian historical snippet from 1926, and my subtitle, This Newspaper Clipping Has It All for Presby Nerds. And I'm persuaded that there are some Presby nerds on the other end of the Presbycast feeds. So let's just run through it, and it won't take long, and I will embellish and annotate as we go. But that's fine because it's not very long, and if I didn't do that, we'd be done very shortly. And we'll see the newspaper clipping and the interesting juxtaposition, and then the interesting current day connections to some of the things connected to this newspaper clipping. So let me read the first paragraph. And let me first qualify. I used to be a newspaper guy, and our little weekly newspaper locally still has
a religion page or a religion section. And the main purpose of that is to sell ads to churches. But it used to be that if your church was of any size and you were respectable, you would take out an ad every Saturday in the newspaper, the local daily newspaper, and it would tell who was speaking at your church, and the more money you had, the bigger ad you could have. And if you had a special event, as we're going to have in view here, one of the speakers being Machen, you would take out a big ad, and you can tell that these churches are competing at this point. But this is from February of 1926. Let me read the first paragraph. The religious announcements page of a St. Louis newspaper in early 1926 reminds us of how things change and how things stay the same. Mainline, he was a Northern Baptist. I think he helped found the Northern Baptist Convention. But mainline Northern Baptist theologian Shaler Mathews, that's Mathews with one T, Shaler Mathews, yes, that's his real name, Shailer, was one of the leading proponents of the social gospel after Walter Rauschenbusch. Rauschenbusch, who was also a Baptist, I think he was in New York. He was sort of the father of the social gospel. But after Rauschenbusch, Mathews was one of the big deals. He taught, and I think he was the president of the UC, which is the University of Chicago Divinity School in, you guessed it, Chicago. That was a leading institution for Protestant liberals. And what some people don't forget is that there were mainline Baptists and there were liberal Baptists, and Shaler Mathews was one of those. All right, I continue. Along with theological liberalism, the social gospel helped doom the mainline churches. I think that's indisputable. Continuing, thus, it's notable that Mathews and J. Gresham Machen, the leading 20th century advocate of, this is what Machen called Orthodox Protestantism in his book Christianity and Liberalism, the leading early 20th century advocate of, quote, the great redemptive religion which has always been known as Christianity. It's notable that the advocate of the social gospel and Orthodox Christianity would be speaking at the same time in the same city. And we'll see that from the ad, which I now have on screen, but I'll point out the relevant parts. At the top, you have, so I guess they paid the most, or they got it in first, a big ad. And I don't know if it was sponsored by the church or by a group of concerned Presbyterians who brought Machen to St. Louis in the heat of the fundamentalist modernist controversy. But not all caps, but in bold and in the largest type at the top, here J. Gresham Machen, noted scholar, author, speaker. And he spoke at 11 a.m. and the title of his sermon, I assume this is at the church, so it's a sermon. 11 a.m., Do We Need Christianity? 8 p.m., Christian Liberty. Now, I should point out that both churches in question here, the Liberal Baptist Church and the Conservative Presbyterian Church, had evening services. That's something to note because very few churches have evening services anymore. I think except for maybe conservative fundamentalist Baptist churches and conservative Reformed churches, you're hard pressed to find a Sunday night service anywhere. But they were the norm, even in the big city of St. Louis, with two highly respectable churches back in 1926. So that's the first interesting thing. Both ads have morning and evening sermons, and thus services. It's interesting that the evening service was at 8. That would strike a lot of people as late these days, but 11 a.m. and 8 p.m., both churches. So that his two talks, Do We Need Christianity? and then Christian liberty. I should note here that Machen often preached topically, except for when he was kind of a long-term stated supply at the Presbyterian Church in Princeton. He probably wouldn't have had the chance to preach through a book. He was generally preaching topical sermons, very different style than some of us might be used to. We might not even consider it exegetical preaching, but it certainly was gospel preaching. So those are two sermons, and he's basically trying to answer a question there. Do we need Christianity? He's going to say yes, and he'll probably define what sort of Christianity that was. And then the topic of Christian liberty, which he considered Protestant liberalism to be injurious to and opposed to Christian liberty. And then in the middle of the afternoon, Machen's the hardest working man in Presby business at this point. He addressed a quote, union mass meeting, according to the ad, which was, could be ecumenical, could be various churches, not just this Presby church in question. And the title of his address there is, What is Christianity? Probably some overlap with that first, Do we need Christianity? Probably a more generic defense of supernatural religion and Orthodox Protestantism, but we don't know for sure. And then under these announcements of the talk titles and times, in all caps, you must hear this man's message. Again, all caps, and then the name of the church, the Washington and Compton Avenue Presbyterian Church. That's not two churches, that's one, but more about them later. Now, the second ad on this page, also very large, was for Second Baptist Church. It announced not the topics that Shaler Mathews, the notable preacher theologian of his day, we don't know the name of his addresses, but they're at the same time, 11 a.m. and 8 p.m. Now, I did not get out Google Maps to see how far apart these two churches were, but my thought is they're probably within a mile or two of each other. The Presbyterian Church has moved. Again, more about that later. But we have a battle of the theologians here, and we really have the conflict of two religions. Machen said that that's why he titled his book from 1923, Christianity and Liberalism. His point was that Protestant liberalism was a different religion, and that's why I quoted that great redemptive religion known as Christianity, because he considered Protestant liberalism not to have a proper view of redemption and often lacking the atonement, no redemption at all, just an exhortation to imitate and to do. So here we have the ad, the two addresses from the two great men. Let me continue with the text. As Machen would see it, the titles of his three sermons or talks were opposed to, and this is the term he used for liberalism, that modern redemptive religion called modernism or liberalism. And that's the way he put it in Christianity and Liberalism. Liberalism could not give an unequivocal answer to the question, the title of his first talk, do we need Christianity? Their answer to that question, as evidenced by the missions controversy later, when after the report funded by Rockefeller, Rethinking Missions, they basically said, we don't need to take the gospel to these heathens. We just need to teach them how to be good Buddhists, good Hindus, good Muslims, and we're going to be so nice and attractive, they're going to like us, and some of them will like Jesus, but if they don't, they'll be better, and that might also mean they'll be better colonial subjects or better markets for U.S. goods. Let's just be honest. All right, so I'm riffing on the titles of his talks. I'm saying that Protestant liberalism could not give an unequivocal answer to the question, do we need Christianity? And then For the second talk, being unbiblical, liberalism was injurious to Christian liberty. That's actually the second sermon with the talk in between. And then the afternoon or mass meeting or rally, that's what they often called it, a meeting like that. The title of the talk was the question, what is Christianity? And I write that was certainly a vexing question for many, both inside and outside the mainline churches in the 1920s. It was a tumultuous time for the mainline and for other churches too. Christianity was as much under fire then as now. The gospel was as unclear then for many as it is now. And I continue. The definitions, that is, of Christianity that famed liberals like Harry Emerson Fosdick and Mathews, who were both Baptists, by the way, the definitions they gave of Christianity would have differed greatly from the definitions provided by Machen and the Reformed, or even of the fundamentalists, a few of whom might have actually attended the afternoon Union Mass meeting. Again, those were usually called gospel rallies or something like that. Not many Presbyterians held revival meetings, but they would have rallies. That's interesting. And then I have a picture of Shaler Mathews with one of his book titles called The Atonement and the Social Process. Now, I could tell you, if you read that book, you would probably be horrified, because there'd be a lot of very progressive, if not socialist, political theory, and with some sort of reference to the atonement. And it wouldn't be the atonement, I don't think, that we're familiar with and that we hold to. All right, let's note a few other things about these churches that are involved in this battle of the theologians. I've already mentioned this, both churches had evening services, an increasingly rare thing 100 years later, actually 99 years later. The publicity for Machen's talks was very aggressive. They had all caps in the sermon titles. And again, as I mentioned before, you must hear this man's message. Most Presbyterians are not so comfortable with aggressive marketing anymore, but they had it here. Note that with the ad that we just referred to, Machen's hosts appealed to crisis, while the church that hosted Mathews touted respectability. There was a picture, an engraving in their ad of the Baptist church's huge tower, and they noted in the ad for the Shaler Mathews talk, this Second Baptist Church was founded in January 6, 1833. Actually, I have a typo there. I said 1933, but the church was nearly 100 years old in 1926. And let's see that church for our live viewers. It's massive, and it has a weird tower that's disconnected from the two large buildings on either side, somewhat reminiscent of the Italian three building, two baptistry, tower, and church building. Sort of like with Pisa, the Field of Dreams, or if you've ever been to Florence, you've got the baptistry, the Duomo, and the tower. So a lot of money, a lot of respectability, assumedly a lot of people at this big old Second Baptist Church. Now, it's interesting to note that church is gone. It's not there anymore. A little more about that. All right, so I continue with the article. Some things have remained the same since this time. The battle for the gospel is still ongoing. Some things have changed, however. The mainline churches, which once seemed to run the country, are shrinking to a near vanishing point. The fumes of orthodoxy and respectability that they used to have barely carried them to the end of the 20th century. And then I make the bold statement, they will not survive to the end of the 21st century. Now, a little bit more about church names and buildings. one last nugget. The Washington and Compton Avenue Presbyterian Church moved later that year in 1926, and it changed its name when it did so. It moved to a new building that was nearly as grand as the Second Baptist Church. It was large and very impressive. Um, the new name of that church, the former Washington and Compton Avenue Church, is well known to those who follow events in the PCA or in the last several years, lately, in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. That church where Machen spoke became Memorial Presbyterian Church in St. Louis. We have it on screen there. It's an amazing building. They hosted Machen more than once, and that's the church famous for hosting Revoice. The pastor prior to the pastor who's currently there was one of the few Presbyterian Church in America ministers who ever stood a full-blown heresy trial. And his name was George Stulac. So somewhere between 1926 and even much later, because I think old Palmer Robertson might have done a little time there, but sometime between the 50s or 60s and 70s and maybe the 80s, 90s, and since, this church has changed a good bit, as I'm sure the neighborhoods have and other things. So that's Memorial Presbyterian Church. That's where Machen preached, although not in the same building. It was on a different street now and a different name. Now, this incredibly impressive Second Baptist Church, which I showed you, it's not there anymore. It's been defunct as a church for about 20 years. Now, what I told you about the main line vanishing, many of the mainline churches have already gone out of business, if you will. Some of that's because of demographics or neighborhoods, no doubt, generational issues. But this church hasn't hosted a worship service for 15 or 20 years. This Second Baptist Church, where the famous liberal preached, assumedly they bought into his liberalism, his social gospel, which is really no gospel at all. And the impressive tower actually burned a few years ago. And the future for this incredible building, I have linked to an article, is that it may become sort of a gospel music, I think black gospel music center. So you can click on the link if you go to the Substack piece, which I'll link to, and you'll see how things change, things stay the same, and churches go out of business. The one that hosted Shaler Mathews way back there in 1926 is no more. And the glory has departed, if you will. We don't want Ichabod written over any of our church names. And we do know that people and officers in liturgy and doctrine are much more important than buildings. So that's the story of this particular. It just shows that as you scroll through old newspapers, whether they be religious or secular, there are interesting things to be learned. I love to go through the old Presbyterian Guardian and some of the other ones. Again, this is from newspapers.com, but what you learn is that, and we've mentioned this before, Machen was a national media figure. He was often quoted. There are stories about him in large newspapers, New York Times, Philadelphia paper, of course, the New York Herald Tribune, which published his response to FDR, which I'm looking for that to get the full thing. He was a notable figure, and it shows how the mighty, that is the main line, have fallen since that time. And there's lots that could be said about that, but there's no no doubt. So this, again, was from the St. Louis Daily Globe Democrat, Saturday morning, February 13th, 1926. St. Louis Post-Dispatch is the remaining paper in St. Louis. This paper, sort of like Second Baptist Church, no longer exists. So there you go. There's Machen is one of his famous quotes is let me see if I can do it from memory. In the field of religion, as in other spheres, the things about which men are agreed are apt to be the things least worth holding. The really important things are the things about which men will fight. Probably weren't a lot of fence sitters in 1926. There weren't many people flipping a coin to decide whether to go to Second Baptist to hear Shaler Mathews or to Washington and Compton Avenue Presbyterian Church to hear J. Gresham Machen. But here you have it on one day in one Midwestern city of some note. You had a veritable Donnybrook between these two saying different things at the same time. And of course, Carl Trueman wrote a piece for Reformation 21 that I'd like to riff on at some point in written form about tragedy and how tragedy is an important element in religion, and that with the theology of the cross rather than theology of glory, there's a tragic nature to the church and to the life of Christ. Ultimately, of course, Christ triumphs, but that's often not our experience. And there's tragedy here. We know that Machen died 11 years later at the young age of in his early to mid 50s. And the church that he formed was very small. Very few people went with him as he left the main line. He was treated badly by the Northern Mainline Church, the PCUSA, and he had a hard way to go. So J. Gresham Machen, in many ways, a tragic yet faithful figure, and the main line is an even greater tragedy. They went from millions upon millions of members, and again, they're dwindling to near nothing today. But it shows that doctrine matters. The OPC, which Machen helped form in 36, if you look at it, even though it started really small, it's really grown at a fairly similar rate to the PCA. The PCA started much larger and is much, much larger, but it was a tough time, and it's a warning for us why we don't let things get as bad as they were in the main line, and why we don't let it get away from us if we can. God's sovereign, but he calls us to be faithful. I think Machen certainly was, though to call him successful, especially for the next several decades, would have been a hard case to make. So that's all I've got. Rare Saturday night show. One of the reasons I did this, besides staying awake, was to try out the studio after I'd sort of torn it down and rebuilt it. Hopefully 2 weeks from tomorrow night, we're going to have a special in studio. Or is it? No, it's a week from tomorrow night. I think on the 20, well, we'll see. I think a week from Monday, a week from this next Monday, we're going to have a live show. May have Resby in the house and another friend. So I've got it all set up. It's going to be good. And thank you for those who listened. A not insignificant number tonight. And I probably won't mess with this tonight. I'll put it out Monday morning or late tomorrow night after church as a podcast. So thanks for listening. And, on short notice, I found some great music, and we'll use some more of this lady's Presby sax, even though I'm sure she wasn't Presbyterian. Not sexy sax, Presby sax. So let's hear a little bit more on the way out. Thanks for listening, and I'm sure Resby would want me to tell you not to be an Erdman.
What's wrong with you people?